As I said in an earlier lecture, wars have a way of making things possible, making things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise or wouldn't have happened so quickly otherwise. The American Revolutionary War, besides freeing the United States from British control, also paved the way for American democracy as ordinary people fought for American independence and realized that they were responsible for the victory over Britain. These ordinary people began to think that they ought to exercise political power. After all, that's what the Declaration of Independence was all about, that people had the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal, and all of that. It took a while. It took a while for the elites to catch on and to let ordinary people start to exercise political power. But the seeds were planted then. I mentioned that the Civil War made possible the emancipation of Southern slaves. Under the Constitution, slavery had existed for 3/4 of a century, and the American political system could not figure out how to deal with it, how to deal with the contradiction between the promise of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, they have the right to life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and the existence of slavery. So the peacetime political system couldn't deal with it, couldn't find its way to emancipation. But in war, it happened. It happened through the Emancipation Proclamation, issued as on Lincoln's authority as Commander-in-Chief, and then the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which ended slavery once and for all. Other wars, World War I. World War I was a really big deal in demonstrating the capacity of central government, of the American government, for mobilizing the American economy in a single direction. So during World War I, the federal government essentially nationalized large parts of the economy, which means it took control. It didn't actually take ownership. That's what nationalism fully means. But it took control of the railroad industry, of the steel industry, of the automobile and other big industries, and turned them to the purposes of the war. And Americans were willing to accept it. And this is the key, that Americans are willing to accept greater intrusions on their lives by government during war. But there was another aspect to World War I which was equally important for the evolution of American politics and American life during the 20th century. During World War I, Northern factory workers were drafted into the army. They went off to war, leaving empty spots in the factories, at the mills and the mines and all the places where they had been working before. Because the economy needed the labor, for the first time in large numbers, African Americans from the American South began moving north to take those jobs. It was the lure of jobs. There was an internal migration, sometimes called the Great Migration. It was key because at the end of the Civil War, the great majority of African Americans in the United States lived in states of the former Confederacy and states of the former slave states. The population of Northern blacks was comparatively small. And so to the extent that America had a race problem, which was the way it was usually, very often stated, to the extent that race relations was a challenge for the United States, it was seen largely as a Southern problem. And it was for this reason, among others, that the Jim Crow system in the South was allowed to persist as long as it did, because it was primarily a Southern problem. Northerners, the ones who were more likely to work for greater equality between the races, well, it wasn't a problem that they faced every day. There were populations, but small populations of African Americans in northern cities. But the big numbers began to develop during World War I. And so especially young black men moved north to take jobs in the factories of Chicago, of Detroit, of Cleveland, of eventually New York. They moved throughout the country, but primarily to the industrial cities of the Midwest. There was an easy travel route basically up the Mississippi River. Interestingly, and the irony was pointed out, that in the days of slavery, one of the worst things that could happen to a slave was to be sold down the river. That was the term. And it meant to be sold from typically a state of the upper South, Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, down the river, down the Mississippi River to the sugar and cotton plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana. This was the really hard labor, and if you went down the river, you quite often were never heard from again. You were separated from your family, and that was the worst fate that could befall a slave. And so to go up the river, to reverse the migration, had a certain kind of historical irony or fittingness to it. In any event, for the first time, African Americans inhabited the cities of the North, the industrial cities of the North. And this would be very important because now, for the first time, Northerners, the ones, as I say, who had been more inclined to think that African Americans ought to receive equal rights or something more approaching a full recognition of their civil rights than Southerners, they now have African Americans living within their midst. Things didn't always go well. In fact, there were race riots in places like Chicago and places like Detroit, and this was actually especially true after the war, as some of the workers came back and wanted their jobs back and found that the jobs had been taken by African Americans. And then the whole question of where would the migrants from the South live? They moved into neighborhoods that until then had often been relatively exclusively the reserve of one ethnic group or another, and they were these outsiders who were bidding up the price of houses and basically requiring the people who already lived there to make changes they didn't particularly want to make. Anyway, so the Great Migration of World War I nationalized racial issues in a way that they hadn't been before. And once again, it would take a while for the country as a whole to grapple with these, but a start was made. Get to World War II. And World War II, being the biggest war in world history, probably had the largest effects on both American life, American society, and on the world at large. In some respects, World War II extended the effects of World War I. So once again, there was a migration from the South to the North. This, in response to the same sorts of things, American industries were nationalized or taken control of by the federal government more quickly and for a longer period than had been the case in the First World War, because the war was longer and the war was a bigger deal. Furthermore, one of the things the war did quite sort of unexpectedly was to give ex post facto credibility to the New Deal. The New Deal was Franklin Roosevelt's and the Democrats' program for dealing with the Great Depression. And the fundamental job of the New Deal was to lift the country out of the Depression, out of poverty, and to restore prosperity. And it did not do that. There were some changes that were made, and things got a little bit better, but on the whole, the idea that the country was going to get back on track economically kept moving more and more into the future. And the stock market crashed in 1929. As of 1939, a whole 10 years later, the economy was still mired in depression. Then comes World War II. World War II began in Europe in 1939. Fighting had begun in Asia in 1937. And the mere possibility that the United States might go to war caused the federal government to begin spending on wartime preparations, building up munitions, building ships, drafting people into the army and making them ready. It began to revive the economy. It also did something else. It did something specific for Franklin Roosevelt's reputation. Franklin Roosevelt would end his term as president by his death in 1945, widely considered to be one of the greatest American presidents ever. If not for World War II, Franklin Roosevelt would not have achieved that distinction. Because he would not have been able to run for a third term as president. There was a de facto ban on third terms. This had been established by George Washington when he left office after 2 terms as the first president. But with war looming, and with a perceived necessity for the United States to be led by someone who had experience in world affairs, American voters were willing to tolerate Roosevelt's attempt at a third term, and they elected him. Now, what this meant was that when the war did come, Roosevelt was president at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, so Roosevelt became a wartime president. And wartime presidents have a chance of being considered great historical figures, especially if the country wins the war. So Abraham Lincoln, usually considered to be the greatest of American presidents, Lincoln was president during the Civil War. He held the country together. If Franklin Roosevelt could lead the United States to victory in World War II, then his reputation would be assured. But more than that, Roosevelt was still president, unexpectedly, in a third term, when World War II revived the American economy. And because Roosevelt was the president responsible for the New Deal, and then Roosevelt gets elected, the New Deal comes, there's a little bit of a pause, and then the economy revives. Now, because of the World War, not really because of the New Deal, but nonetheless, it looked as though you could make a case that it was the New Deal that belatedly revived the economy. It wasn't actually the case, but nonetheless, this is what Roosevelt gets credit for. And historically, Roosevelt is the president who brought America back to prosperity. True, he was the president of the New Deal, so it was tempting to think that the New Deal revived the economy. Again, it was misleading, but sometimes in politics you get credit for stuff you're not really responsible for. But the war did something else, though. Aside from reviving the economy, it sort of lent credence to the basic premise of the New Deal, that government can solve America's problems. Maybe not all of them, and can't solve them perfectly, but government can make a big dent in America's problems. If not for World War II, Roosevelt and the New Deal would not have been able to make a persuasive case for that position, because the New Deal had expanded American government, and the government, and the economy was still in depression. It hadn't worked. But then comes the war. The government, of course, is responsible for the war effort. The government takes over more industries, expands its authority, and, critically, the United States won the war. So Americans come out of World War II with the idea that government works. Government can solve problems. Now, this is really important. At the time, it seemed, just natural. That's what government does. But over the course of the next 30, 40 years, Americans would change their minds on this subject. So by the time Ronald Reagan becomes president, Reagan would say government isn't the solution to America's problems, government is the problem itself. Well, there was some forgetting that had gone on, but World War II really made a strong case that the government of the United States is a force for good in individuals' lives and in the world. So, other aspects of the war, other side effects of the war, other influences of the war on things that probably would have happened anyway, but might not have happened so fast. World War II brought women into the workforce in a way that nothing else before them had. Women had been edging their way into the modern, first thing I should say, is that women were always workers on farms. They didn't always plow the fields, but they took care of the vegetable gardens, they tended some of the livestock, they picked the eggs. So on farms, women were understood to be equal partners in the labor effort. As America industrialized, there was a division of labor. And so typically men went off to the factories and women stayed home with the kids. And this became a model, especially as white-collar jobs developed in offices. So In a white-collar job, okay, the man typically would be the breadwinner. He'd go off to work, and women would tend to the kids. Now, there were jobs for women during certain parts of women's lives. So young women before they were married, for example, could and did go to work in textile factories, for example, in places around New England. So women working, it was not unheard of in the industrial age, but it wasn't common, and it usually wasn't more than for a brief period of time. In World War II, as American soldiers went off to do battle, and some 16 million Americans, the great majority of the men, were under arms during World War II, which meant that 16 million people, 16 million workers, had been taken away from jobs. Jobs that needed doing more than ever with the economy humming and providing the stuff that's necessary for the war. So who's going to take the jobs? Well, in some cases, more African Americans migrating from the South, but increasingly, women stepped into those jobs. Now, it's significant that the economy had evolved in the direction and to the degree it had, because if most of the jobs were just sort of the unskilled, heavy lifting kind of jobs that had often been the case in the early phases of the Industrial Revolution, then women would have been less able simply to step in. But by the 1940s, the decade of World War II, many of the jobs had been not exactly automated. They hadn't been automated so that they didn't require any kind of human supervision. But they had been automated to the extent that the heavy lifting was done by machines. And so the workers actually sort of oversaw the machines. And so women were able to step into those jobs and to succeed fairly well. And not only was there the economic incentive to do this, but there was a kind of social and political incentive to make this acceptable, because the jobs needed doing for the war effort. And women who might have thought, I don't know if this job is for me, I don't know if I can do it, I don't know if I ought to do it, they could see posters, I mean, famous posters of this, the archetype of the woman worker, Rosie the Riveter. Rosie is this woman on the picture who is running, using a riveting machine in a factory, and hey, you know, turns out Rosie can do it as well as the guy that she replaced. And so women are getting this encouragement. It is your patriotic duty to go to work. Now, this was particularly significant coming after the Great Depression, because during the Great Depression, jobs were scarce, and it was not uncommon for employers to make the judgment call that men needed jobs more than women did. The reasoning was that, well, most men and most women of adult age are married, and the guy is more likely to be the principal breadwinner in the family than the woman. The perception was that many women were taking the jobs sort of as a second job, whereas if there was one job in the family, it was usually held by men. I mean, this was the perception. And so there wasn't a huge outcry against this. Okay, if you have to lay off people, lay off the women first. As a result, the opportunities, the economic opportunities for women declined dramatically during the Great Depression. And so a lot of women who otherwise would have worked didn't have jobs. Now all of a sudden, jobs are available. And so women entered the workforce, the paid workforce. I should make a point here too, that when women were stereotypically wives and mothers, it's not like they were working. Anybody who's had a mother or been a mother knows that there's a lot of work involved in raising the kids, but we're talking here about the paid workforce, so they get a salary. So anyway, so women entered the paid workforce in much larger numbers during World War II than they ever had before. And this set in motion expectations regarding what the post-war economy would look like. Now, it is true, after the war was over, many, first of all, the soldiers came home and they reclaimed some of their jobs, and many of the women, some of the women were willing to work during wartime when the country needed them, but then they would go back home and they would raise their families. But there were enough who stayed in the workforce and enough who expected to stay in the workforce that it changed perceptions regarding the opportunities that were and should be available for women in the American economy. A second set of expectations that were raised by the war in America were expectations among African Americans regarding what they should expect in the way of civil rights and political rights. As I said, during World War I, African Americans took advantage of economic demand for their labor. This continued during World War II. But in World War II, something else was going on. That there were more men, more soldiers under arms in World War II than in any other American war, before or after. And many of these soldiers, including many people who were drafted into the war, were African American. And they were brought into the American military, but it was a segregated military. And so black soldiers fought in black regiments. And it was, this really struck an odd tone, because the watchword of America's war effort, the point of going to war, was to save democracy. The United States and Britain were fighting for democracy. Their ally was communist Soviet Union, but nonetheless, what Americans were fighting for in Europe, fighting for in Asia, was democracy, the American way of life. And black soldiers in the American Army, in the American Navy, they discovered that they were fighting for democracy. They were fighting for the rights of people in other countries that they didn't receive in their own country. And there was an emerging consciousness among African Americans. And it began to take greater note than before of the discrepancy between the promise of America, all men are created equal, and the practice of America, the Jim Crow system of segregation, which existed in the military. And black soldiers died just like white soldiers died, but they couldn't get buried in the same cemeteries and they didn't receive the same respect. And black soldiers knew that, okay, we'll fight hard, we will win the war, we will make sure that democracy reigns in Europe, and we're going to come home and we're not going to receive democracy at home. Democracy, one of the most basic aspects of democracy, is the right to vote. And although the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1870, nominally said that everybody could vote in the United States irrespective of race, not women until 1920, but nonetheless, the right to vote could not be abridged on account of race. It wasn't practiced, and in most southern states where most blacks still live, most black people couldn't vote. Various subterfuges, various ruses and dodges had been developed to keep black people from voting. And so soldiers in the war, they basically took the position, okay, during the war we'll keep our heads down, we'll fight hard, we'll win the war. But when we come home, we're going to demand something much closer to the full rights we're supposed to be getting under the Constitution. So there was something that was called the Double V for Victory campaign. We'll win victory against fascism abroad, and then we'll come home and win victory against segregation. And in fact, it was not long after the soldiers came home that new and serious efforts were made to demand equal rights, to demand civil rights for African Americans in the United States. There's a third, I don't know what number I'm on, but another aspect, another effect of World War II was sort of like the effect on race relations in the United States, but taken globally. World War II was the last great war of the empires. And the big empires of the world, the big European empires, were the British Empire and the French Empire. The Germans had, well, they had something of an empire, but it had been taken away after World War I. But the British Empire and the French Empire, they covered much of Africa. So much of Africa was under the control of either the British or the French. The French had say in most of West Africa, and the British in East Africa and Southern Africa. And the French had an empire in Southeast Asia. The Dutch had an empire in what would become Indonesia. So there were these European empires. And during the war, soldiers from the empires, soldiers from India, for example, soldiers from British-controlled India fought for the British Empire in the name of democracy and in the name of resisting oppression and takeovers by oppressive foreign governments. And the Indian soldiers looked at this and they said, well, what are we doing? Fighting for the rights of other people, rights that we don't have ourselves. And during the war, so there were millions of Indian soldiers in the British Army. And they began to realize, wait a minute, this just doesn't seem to fit. We're fighting for other people's rights, rights that we don't have ourselves. As in the case of African Americans, they said, okay, we'll fight during the war, but once the war is over, we're going to demand these rights ourselves. There was something else that happened, and that was that the credibility, the reputation of the European empires took a serious hit during World War II. There had long been a feeling, started back in the 19th century, that Europeans were simply better at war than Asians. Europeans were more advanced economically and therefore technologically, and so they had better guns and bigger weapons and all this stuff. So a relatively small British army could force its way into and take control of India, and the Dutch could do the same in Indonesia and the French in Indochina. But the war came along and demonstrated that the Europeans were not invincible. In fact, one of the first serious cases of this came when Japan, Asian Japan, this is critical, Asian Japan invaded French Indochina and took control of the place. I mean, the French were distracted by being invaded by Germany, but nonetheless, the European empires could not stand up to, well, Asian people. And this was a big deal. The Japanese, they took control of Indochina, they took control of Indonesia during the war. And so the French Empire in particular took a big hit. The French Empire collapsed in front of the German invasion. And so people living in Indochina, people living in Indonesia said, hey, they're not so tough. We could, if the Japanese can beat them, we can beat them. This was really important. The Indian, people living in India, said if we're fighting for other people's rights, then we should demand those rights ourselves. And the last thing, but in the same vein, is that the war really put a strain to the point of bankruptcy. It essentially bankrupted the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire. And running an empire is no easy thing, it's no cheap thing, especially if you lose the support or at least the acquiescence of the people that you're governing in those foreign countries. And so Britain came out of the war, it still had its possessions, but it could no longer afford to defend them, especially if the Indians, for example, said, you got to get out of here. And so the war marked the beginning of the end of the imperial system of the European empires. And so it's no accident, it's no coincidence that in the decade after the war, and then the decade after that, the European empires crumbled. And by the mid-1960s, the European empires were all but finished. Now this is important, not simply for world history, but for American history, because the United States was going to be involved in the crumbling of some of those empires. In particular, the United States would get involved in the aftermath of the crumbling of the French Empire in Indochina, which gave rise to America's participation in the Vietnam War. But that's a story for another day.